James stood at the edge of the empty high school track, the faint buzz of distant traffic his only company. The gray morning sky mirrored his mood, heavy and uncertain. He'd been here before. This wasn't the first time he'd laced up his running shoes and promised himself he'd do better. And yet, every time he came close to taking that first step, a familiar voice would creep in. Why bother? You'll quit just like you always do. Today was no different. His stomach churned with a mix of fear and doubt. There was no crowd. No opponent waiting to test his limits, only him. It should have been easier. But James knew this was the hardest challenge of all. No one could cheer him past the finish line. No coach could yell loud enough to drown out the internal voice. That said, you're not good enough. The real competition wasn't against a timer or another runner. It was against a version of himself that never believed he could be more. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the sharp, cold air. The scent of damp grass reminded him of early mornings long ago when he would watch the older athletes run laps while he sat on the bleachers, daydreaming about being just like them. He used to imagine what it would feel like to cross the finish line with his head held high, to feel the pride of knowing he'd given it everything he had. Back. Then he was a spectator. And now, even standing here, ready to run, he still felt like a spectator of his own life. The voice in his head was already gearing up. You'll never make it past one lap. Just turn around and go home. But something kept James rooted to the spot, hands fidgeting with his shoelaces. He wasn't sure if it was stubbornness or hope, maybe both, but he refused to walk away. This time, he'd grown tired of the cycle. Try, doubt, quit, regret. If he turned back now, he knew exactly what would happen. He'd spend the rest of the day beating himself up, telling himself he could have done it, if only he'd tried harder. He glanced down at his shoes, their soles worn thin. They'd seen countless false starts. Not today, he muttered under his breath. Today I'm starting. The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, like a language he'd almost forgotten how to speak. But as he said them, they began to sound more real, more possible. James took one step forward, then another. The track felt foreign beneath his feet, as if it were testing his resolve. He looked straight ahead, not at the finish line, but just a few yards in front of him, one step at a time, he thought. His pulse quickened not from exertion, but from the unfamiliar thrill of finally moving forward. The voice in his head still whispered its doubts, but James drowned it out with the steady rhythm of his footsteps. And so, James began the most important race of his life, the race against himself. James' feet slapped against the worn, rubbery surface of the track, each stride a battle against his own body and mind. The initial rush of starting had given way to something heavier, something harder. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, and his legs ached like they hadn't in years. It wasn't long before the first wave of doubts came rushing back. Why are you doing this to yourself? The voice taunted. No one's watching. No one will care if you stop. For a moment, James wavered. He slowed, his pace faltering. As he glanced down at his legs, the familiar ache in his muscles felt like proof that he was right to give up. But then another thought crept in, a small whisper almost drowned out by the noise of his doubt. What if this time is different? It was a simple thought, but it was enough to keep his feet moving. He wasn't sprinting. He wasn't even running at full speed. He just kept a steady rhythm, pushing forward step by step. As he rounded the second turn of the track, James realized that the fight wasn't against the pain in his legs or the burning in his lungs. The real fight was against the story he'd been telling himself for years, that he couldn't do this, that he wasn't strong enough, that quitting was inevitable. He started focusing on smaller goals. Instead of thinking about completing a full lap, he focused on reaching the next bend in the track, then the next. With each small milestone, the voice in his head grew quieter. The resistance he felt wasn't vanishing. It was shifting. James began to understand that the struggle wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. The Resistance was proof that he was changing, growing. Every time his legs screamed at him to stop, and every time he ignored them, he was proving himself wrong. He was proving the voice wrong. The more he pushed through, the more he noticed little victories. The first time he completed a lap without stopping. The first time he steadied his breathing. The first time he realized he wasn't thinking about quitting anymore. They were small, quiet victories. No one else would notice them, but James felt their power. He felt himself beginning to shift. By the end of the second lap, James slowed to a walk. Not because he was giving up, but because he knew he needed to regroup. His breath was still heavy, and his legs felt like they were made of lead, but something was different. He hadn't stopped because he felt defeated. He'd stopped because he wanted to be strategic. He wasn't quitting. He was learning how to keep going. As he reached down to adjust his shoelaces, James couldn't help but smile. He wasn't there yet, but for the first time, he felt like he could be. Tasks, you said. By the third lap, James hit what he could only describe as the wall. It wasn't just a physical sensation, though his legs felt like cinder blocks and his lungs burned. It was the mental hammering that took him by surprise. Each stride seemed harder than the last, his mind pounding with questions he didn't want to answer. What's the point of this? Why keep going when no one will know if you stop? Who are you trying to fool? He slowed to a shuffle and finally stopped, hands on his knees, gasping for air. Sweat poured down his temples, stinging his eyes. For a moment, he stood completely still, caught in a swirling storm of self-doubt and exhaustion. The quiet track around him seemed to echo the voice in his head, bouncing his fears and frustrations back at him. But then, through the haze, came a memory. He thought of the countless times he'd given up on himself before. Not just in running, but in everything. He thought of the guitar lessons he abandoned after only 2 months. The business idea he'd once been passionate about but let wither because he couldn't bear the early struggles. The friendships he'd let fade because he was too afraid of being vulnerable. Each memory was a brick in the wall he was facing now, and then came another thought, soft at first but growing louder. A simple question: what if you don't stop this time? It wasn't a magical moment. No triumphant soundtrack played in his mind. He was still tired, still sore, still fighting against the voice that told him to quit. But this single thought, what if I keep going, brought a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He straightened up, his breath still, heavy, and looked down the stretch of track in front of him. His legs begged him not to start again. His mind rattled off excuses for why today wasn't the day. But James made the choice to take one step forward, and then another, and then another. His pace was slow and uneven, but he was moving again. It wasn't about running a perfect lap anymore. It wasn't even about finishing a specific number of laps. The turning point wasn't in reaching the finish line. It was in deciding not to stop. James realized that every time he moved forward, even if only by a few steps, he was rewriting the narrative. Each stride was a defiance of the voice that told him he wasn't capable. Each step made the doubt a little quieter, the hope a little louder. When James rounded the bend and found himself on the home stretch of his third lap, he didn't feel like a different person, but he felt like someone on the brink of change. Someone who had stood at the edge of quitting and chosen to push on instead. As he crossed the line, he knew he hadn't won anything yet. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was losing either. The wall wasn't gone, but he'd found a way to start chipping away at it. And with each step forward, it became a little less impossible. James stood at the edge of the track, hunched over, catching his breath. The sun was fully up now, lighting the field in a golden glow. He had completed his fourth lap finally, and something felt different this time. Not in his body, his legs still ached, his lungs still burned. It was in his mind. He straightened and looked around. The empty bleachers hadn't magically filled with a cheering crowd. There was no medal, no celebration, just silence. And yet, He felt a deep satisfaction he couldn't quite explain. James had won no trophies, set no records. The only thing he had conquered was himself. But that, he realized, was enough. As he walked a slow lap to cool down, he let his mind wander back over everything he'd been through. All the times he quit too soon. All the mornings he'd promised to start again only to walk away. He saw now that those moments weren't failures. They were just part of the process. He thought of them as defeats, but they'd been lessons. Each one had taught him what didn't work. Each one had prepared him for this moment. He had finally faced the loudest, most persistent critic in his life, the one in his own head. And for once, he had him back down. James thought about how easy it would have been to stop today, to walk away and chalk it up to another failed attempt. But he didn't. He had taken that first step and kept going. Even when it hurt. Even when the voice screamed at him to quit. He had proved to himself that he didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to finish fast, didn't have to meet anyone else's expectations. He just had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. As the sun rose higher, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A quiet confidence. Not the fleeting kind that came from a compliment or an easy success. This was deeper. This was the kind of confidence you earn by facing your worst fears, by standing toe-to-toe with the part of you that says, "You can't," and saying back, "Watch me." James knew that the voice would return. The doubt would creep back in at some point, but he also knew now that he had the strength to push through it. He discovered a truth about himself, that he was capable of more than he believed. He could choose to keep going, no matter how loud the critic in his mind became. And with every future step, he'd grow a little stronger, a little more, sure of his ability to keep moving forward. As James left the track and started his walk home, he felt no need to share what he'd done, no need to post about it, no need to tell anyone. He smiled to himself, knowing that he had just fought the toughest battle of his life and won tasks.